Hello and welcome again to our Leadership for Faithful Innovation series. We are still in our segment on listening. Today we're blessed to have Pastor Eric Fink with us, who is going to be sharing with us in this section on listening around spiritual stories and how Leadership for Faithful Innovation was able to help elicit some great stories from your work with the congregation. So welcome, Eric.
Well, thank you. Good to be here, Rick.
Hey, I'm glad to have you too. Pastor Eric, I understand that Living Springs has been really involved in the LFI program for a couple of years now. Can you talk a little bit generally about what that's been like for your congregation and for you as a leader?
Oh, yeah, it's just been a tremendous blessing. We started in 2018-ish, I believe, and really laid a lot of groundwork for things that came up with, the pandemic, all the challenges that if we had not gone through this blessing of faithful innovation for a couple years prior to that, it would have made it even more. It was intimidating and scary enough, but would have even made it more so. Just a lot of the process, their tools that are offered, but it was more a conceptual and process blessing that allowed us to approach things in a different way. Through this whole understanding of listening and defining and reconnecting. The concept of holy experimenting was a tremendous blessing because we didn't know in the midst of everything changing, not knowing what would be the best or right thing to do, but this freedom to engage in a process of holy experimenting and asking questions like how might we, and all those things that we talked about were really and feedback loops and trying to what did we learn, and it wasn't always a quest to do the right thing, but to trust God to lead us to experiment in a healthy and open way and see where God might lead. So all that came out of this faithful innovation program. We're so blessed for the Synod to be able to provide that for us and have that. And who knows what challenges to ministry there'll be, 5 years, 10 years down the road. But to have this and to have this this toolkit, this conceptual framework to be able to process things through has just been a tremendous blessing, and I can see it working in whatever other challenges the world gives us years ahead. So,
Yeah, we've all gotten to innovate, I think, in the last couple of years. Some of us more prepared than others.
Sure. And just thinking, sitting in the workshops and the dialogues we had in 18, 19, not knowing that all this was coming down the pike, but it was just like, wow. I've got we as a congregation have something to approach this with.
Right.
We might not know what comes out of it, but it's just providential, the divine blessing of the Spirit that allowed us to have that going into everything we've been facing the past couple years.
Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about listening to spiritual stories, of course. And what I thought was interesting about this as kind of the capstone of the listen section is that we've listened to God, we've been listening to the congregation, we've talked a little bit with our neighbors, but this really brings it more formally into people that we're talking to and really trying to get a handle on what God is up to, what divine providence is happening in us and around us and in our community. Can you talk a little bit about that process and what came out of it?
Sure. I was thinking, I brought some of the resources with me because there was one sentence in here that was probably, it's just, here's a possible introduction to your conversation with someone, and there was this sentence, I am interested in learning more about how people experience God. And that was an opening sentence that you could engage in a conversation with someone. And really this spiritual stories, and I'm open to learning more about how people experience God. It was that threefold level. So it was fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, people within the congregation, people within the community of faith, and then expanding that conversation out in a very powerful way to people in the neighborhood, whatever that might be, whether it's congregation members having the freedom to engage in God conversations with literal neighbors, or somebody they might work with. We had so many powerful stories of because we had gone through this experience among leadership and among congregation members, that then individuals were free to engage in a God conversation with someone in their office cubicle, or someone that they a parent of one of their children's schoolmates or teammates sitting in the bleachers. That was an example of a powerful God conversation that happened between one of our parents and another parent whose children happened to be on the same athletic team, just sitting there in the middle of a game. But I don't think, had we been invited to this practice of listening to spiritual stories in the safety of a congregational context to begin with, that it would have been much more intimidating. I'm not saying it wouldn't have happened, because the Spirit does amazing things, but I think it just opened the door. And then the third level was listening to spiritual stories among community leaders, where God might be experienced or seen or witnessed in at maybe at levels that we wouldn't have everyday conversations about necessarily with. So I thought all three of those levels were very powerful. I can say more too, but
So I have to. I'm so intrigued, and
yeah.
so you were able to. So I have to tell you that what really caught my attention is when you're sharing that members of Living Springs actually feeling comfortable having these God conversations with their neighbors, co-workers. But you said something very pivotal, which was, I kind of what I heard was that it started, though, being able to share those same stories within the congregation. That was kind of the starting point.
Sure.
Can you say more about that?
Yeah, and I think that was probably an overall paradigm of faithful innovation too, is that seeing the congregation go down another path for a minute, but seeing congregational life as a safe laboratory for engaging in not just this but other faith practices as well, so that it could happen in daily life, which is really where the rubber hits the road.
Right.
So that was, to digress a little bit, that was another powerful part of this experience. But we were able. We sort of started at leadership levels within ministry teams, councils. So we reframed our council meetings, so based on some suggestions in the kits and of every council meeting would begin with after dwelling in the Word. Well, let's share some God. We use the phrase God stories instead of spiritual stories, but that was okay in that context. And so it was really powerful that we might have the first half an hour of a council meeting might be various council members sharing stories of where they had seen, experienced God during the past month since we gathered, either out in the world or in their daily lives.
How did that impact the rest of your meeting?
Oh, well, yeah, it just shaped, which is, you spend a half an hour talking about God, that really is a cornerstone of this gift, because then it reshapes everything else you're doing. Because we actually we started out just having conversations about God and what God's doing in the world, what God's doing in people's lives. And then inviting, one of those years, then we invited each of our ministry teams to follow that practice that council was doing. So when the ministry teams were meeting, even it was sometimes, I was just thinking about like choir, our bell choir. They wanted to get to practice, and they wanted to do their task, which is holy ground. But they were willing to say, okay, before we practice handbells or before we practice our anthem, we're going to engage in 10 or 15 minutes of sharing where we've each experienced God in the past in our lives, or since the last choir practice or the last handbell practice, and as well as ministry team meetings, youth group, other places. And to the question you just asked, I think it impacted everything else, because like council meetings, everything that was happening started out with conversations not about us or our congregation or our team or our business or whatever. We started out with talking about God. And when you talk about God, it really it opens the heart for the work of the Spirit in deeper ways.
Can you give maybe you have an example, or can you think of something? Because I am intrigued by that, because most I think about council meetings, and I remember reading somewhere that where they did some research around that board meetings, council meetings spend about 85 to 90% around finances, business, so on and so forth. And we're talking within the congregational setting.
Yeah.
And the remaining percentage is around mission, ministry, God talk, that kind of thing. So can you give an example of how this has helped to, from this, how it has helped to shape the ministry, how the council has maybe implemented new ministries or done something different?
Yeah. Well, I think a perspective was that it helped us get outside of our walls a good bit in our conversations and to see things from that perspective. So that even when we were talking about budgets or, I don't know, the annual spending plan, anything, the fact that these conversations had been happening, reset the default. It was like reconnect, redefine, reset the buttons so that the vision wasn't as internal as external. Because so many of the God stories that were shared were stories about things that happened outside of our walls. There were many stories about things happening in that some life was touched or some conversation was had. But for example, one of the council members had a conversation with somebody in his office that was going through a struggle, and they had this God conversation, and he had the freedom to do that because we had been having God conversations in other places, and so that was shared at the beginning of a council meeting. Well, then when we're talking about church stuff, there are more comments about, well, how would that have an impact on, just use a name, Joe, the guy that Joe just talked about, because that and how would whatever we're discussing ministry-wise, budget-wise, what difference would that make in somebody's life, like Joe's coworker?
Right, so it reframed the
Yeah,
conversation.
right. It's just a reframing. Yeah.
Right. So the reframing would be you may be talking like you said, the budget or a concern or what have you, but the God conversation led it back. It would lead it back to why we're having a budget.
Sure.
Why does the budget even exist?
Right.
In other words, it's for ministry to people like Joe or whoever.
Yeah, I just another example would be we're kind of engaged in a fall ministry with the nearby high school with their JV football team, and we go out and do pregame meals for them and a pregame devotion, and then so when we're sharing at a council meeting spiritual stories, and this might get more into that area of neighbors, like having God conversation with your neighbors, but really not under some formal framework. It more happens so that we're out there, and after as the meal's winding down, one of the players comes up and starts talking with one of our Lutheran men who had gone out there that day, and they end up having this holy ground God conversation about some things that are going on in this young man's life and things happening with his parents. So all that is holy ground spiritual conversation. But then the fact that it comes back and gets shared at a ministry team meeting or a council meeting, actually it got shared at both within there weren't naming names, but within those whole parameters of confidentiality, which we talk about. But then we have a discussion later on about youth ministry, and I think without that God story being shared, the whole conversation about youth ministry would have been about, well, when's the youth group meeting, and what it's more like church youth group. But then the conversation about youth ministry was, how can something provide an opportunity for us, for people of the congregation to be interacting with folks? Because we could have held, I don't know, whatever event we would have tried to come up with to get 60 young people from the community to come to our event, and they probably never, might not have ever showed up. But if we could take our half a dozen guys and go out to where 60 young people are, which is getting ready for this football game, and they're willing to have a God conversation with somebody as the dessert's being handed out when the meal's winding down, and then that gets shared in the other context, then that reframed the whole conversation about youth ministry, because it was more not just what's happening with our youth group, but although not diminishing that, but what does ministry look like, because we have opportunities for God to enter a conversation in a holy ground way.
Very powerful.
I think that grows out of this emphasis of listening.
It sounds like a lot of the conversations with neighbors, God almost sent people to your congregation to receive what they needed, as far as, your Joe talking to his coworker and giving him some guidance, or
you're
providing that space.
Right.
But also, the JV football player became part of your congregation's council conversations.
Sure.
God provided that for you, as well as providing it for the youth.
Yep.
I wonder, with the conversations with leaders in the community, how you chose who to talk to, and kind of how those went and what you learned from them.
Yeah, and that piece, that third level, was really guided mostly by our part of the format is to develop, as you know, a guiding team. So we had a faithful innovation guiding team, and one of their goals was to actually engage that particular practice. And so they identified individuals on their own of, I know the fire department guy, or I know one of the persons who's a member of the school board, and someone had a conversation, might have a conversation with her. And so it was more self-identifying for my guiding team, and then they were able to kind of share some holy ground conversations they had with community leaders who they may have had contact with, or at some level some type of relationship with. And that I think that's probably then COVID sort of hit, and that was probably our next step in that level, was then how to grow that from the guiding team to our council members and others who might identify community leaders. Some of that, a lot of that level happened just because we as a congregation are involved in justice ministry. So we encounter a lot of community leaders through our justice ministry, and able to have some God conversations in that context as well. So that was a natural venue for us there.
So you started with some folks who already have some base level of trust with you too, which
Sure,
I'm sure made the conversations a little more fruitful than they might have been otherwise.
Yeah, that's true.
That helps, yeah.
And that the lead line I quoted, I think is even just a helpful. It sounds so simple, but a helpful lead line even at that level, which is, hey, I was just interested in hearing more about how you experience God in our community.
So how would you encourage the leader, the rostered leader out there that is that's listening to this, and they're like, wow, I think I want to try this. And they put so what advice would you give them in helping their councils begin to spend time having God conversations and so on and so, or ministry teams? Any advice you would give them in starting out, or?
No, I reflecting back, I think it was just a process of tilling the soil and providing space for it to happen. I think the first way we were able to do that was in a council retreat setting, so there was more time and space for it, and freedom to, and dwelling. I should mention, dwelling in the Word is almost like the flip side of the coin, because I don't think if we had engaged in dwelling in the Word for a number of months prior, that people would have felt that safe space to have these type of conversations. Because dwelling in the Word, talked a good bit about that, I'm sure, but dwelling in the Word really opened the path for two things. One, it was to just people to feel safe space to talk about what they heard in Scripture. So that opened the door to, this is a safe place to talk. But that it also dwelling in the Word practice for us before COVID was all, you pair up and talk one-on-one, and then you come back and share. So that was a key part to this sharing the spiritual stories to begin with, was that pattern of letting people pair up one-on-one. So I wasn't having to share a spiritual story or a God story with a whole group. It was Emily and I could sit and talk and about some way that we've experienced God or witnessed God at work, and that became a very safe entry point for individuals. And then we could go back and with a larger group, and Emily might could say, well, Eric, just a one-sentence synopsis, which was that whole pattern of dwelling in the Word that we had experienced ahead of time, and that allowed us to do the sharing of the spiritual stories, kind of one-on-one to group.
So it's a lot of practicing and growing and kind of strengthening the muscles of listening and telling the stories.
Sure.
And paying attention to where God is so that we notice
Yeah.
to have something to share next time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the challenging part was when kind of stopped the process, but when we had a few times, and again, COVID sort of changed that, but when we were moving to the point of having it at a congregational level, so that we were able to do this at some congregational fellowship times, and ask people to turn where have you experienced God, share some of the spiritual story questions that are in the material. We were able to do that. But the real sort of pushing the boundary was the few times we have been able to at worship. So in primary worship on Sunday morning, to say, as part of the message time, to carve out time to say, okay, turn to a neighbor and share where you've experienced God during the week, or if you've witnessed God at work. And and that gets a whole hodgepodge of facial reactions at that point. You have to prepare people that you're going to do it for everywhere from folks, but because we had these incremental patterns,
Right.
I think it allowed us to do that, and sort of breaking the ground through Lenten service. So you can get away with almost anything, like a Lenten service or an Advent service midweek, but that allowed us to eventually be bold enough to try on a Sunday morning worship time. Yeah, so.
Good place always a good place to experimentation.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
And modeling, you was asking
Yes.
advice. I think we always found out it was helpful to model at the beginning. So whether it was myself or one of the Faithful Innovation guiding team members or another staff member, to be able to share a spiritual story or experience ahead of time, so that it wasn't just, okay, do this and you have no idea what it's like.
Right.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your spiritual story today.
Yeah.
We really appreciate the work that you and your congregation have put into LFI and your willingness to share it with us.
Yeah.
And we'll probably invite you back to share another chapter on another day.
Okay. that would be wonderful. All right. Thank you so much. It's just been a tremendous gift, and we look forward to seeing where the Spirit might lead in more creative ways.